A hidden government project in the Oregon woods was silencing innocent lives under the guise of harmless forest research. The men behind it, polished, cold, and untouchable, would stop at nothing to keep their secret buried. But when a wounded dog led retired Marine John Carter to the truth, fate gave him one last mission: to expose what power had tried to hide. And just wait until you hear how this battle for truth unfolded, and how justice at last found its voice. John Carter lived at the edge of the small town of Ashford, Oregon, in a modest cabin surrounded by dense forest. Since retiring from the Marines, he had sought peace in the quiet rhythms of rural life. But peace, for John, was fragile. Shadows of the past clung to him. Memories of missions that never ended cleanly, of friends lost, of orders that lingered as questions. His neighbors knew little of him, and John preferred it that way. He liked the solitude. That evening the forest was alive with the scent of autumn: wet earth, pine, and the faint rustle of leaves. John was halfway through his usual evening walk when something unusual broke the stillness. A sharp bark echoed behind his cabin. He paused, listening. There, at the edge of the yard, stood a German shepherd. Its coat was dull, ribs visible beneath its fur. One paw was bent awkwardly, and its eyes, deep and restless, locked on his. It barked again, low and urgent, then bolted toward the forest. Without thinking, John called after it, but it disappeared into the shadow of the trees. A part of him hesitated. Years of training had taught him caution, yet another part, something instinctive, stirred. He grabbed his jacket, tucked his hand into the pocket where his veteran's knife rested, and followed. The dog's paw prints were easy to track in the damp ground, and each step into the forest seemed to pull John deeper into a place that was alive with mystery. The air changed. It became cooler, heavier, as if the forest itself was breathing. Branches arched overhead, forming a natural tunnel that seemed almost deliberate, as though the path had been shaped for him. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and John slowed, every sense alert. The sound of the dog, a faint whine, was ahead, echoing softly through the trees. The trail led him to an area he had never seen before, a clearing tucked away from the world. There, partially hidden by overgrown brush and draping vines, stood a cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered, gray with age, moss clinging to the beams. Windows were dark, but behind one a faint flicker of light glimmered, as if someone, or something, was inside. The sight unsettled John. The cabin should not have been there. It was too secluded, almost impossible to reach without intention. The dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, its body stiff. It let out a low, anxious whine and refused to step closer to the cabin. Its eyes met John's, and he felt the weight of an unspoken warning, yet curiosity burned stronger than caution. He stepped forward slowly, boots crunching against fallen leaves. John's first impression was silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. He pushed the cabin door open. Dust swirled into the pale beam of his flashlight, and the air inside was stale. The room was sparse: a cracked table, a chair tipped over, and shelves lined with jars of faded contents. On one wall, a yellowed blueprint had been pinned carelessly, curling at the edges. John stepped closer, his brow furrowing. The blueprint showed more than a cabin layout. It contained schematics of the surrounding area, marked with strange symbols and notations. At its center, a section of the floor was highlighted, a circle drawn around it with the word beneath. His pulse quickened. His hand lingered on the edge of the blueprint. This was not a random discovery. Something, or someone, had hidden this for a reason. And the dog's insistence, the way it had led him here, felt deliberate, almost as if fate itself had set this path before him. John took a slow breath. Whatever lay beneath this cabin was not an accident. He felt it in his bones. The forest seemed to grow quieter still, as if holding its breath, waiting for him to decide. John Carter stood frozen in the cabin, staring at the blueprint. His fingers traced the faded circle marked beneath. The air seemed heavier now, almost pressing against his chest. His training told him to proceed with caution, but something primal, a mixture of duty and curiosity, pushed him forward. He scanned the wooden floor beneath the blueprint. One plank seemed different, worn in a way the others weren't, its edges smoothed as though handled often. John knelt and pried it loose with his knife. Underneath, a cold draft rose to meet him. A metal handle was set into the wood, worn but polished in certain spots, as if it had been used many times. He tugged firmly. A groan of aged timber answered, and the plank shifted aside, revealing a narrow opening. A spiral staircase of stone and metal curled downward into darkness. The dog let out a sharp bark, low and urgent. Its hackles rose. John glanced down at it. The animal's eyes were fixed on him, wide and expectant, as if warning him not to proceed. For a heartbeat, John hesitated. Every instinct in him screamed caution. But he had followed the dog this far, and now he felt the pull of something greater. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and stepped into the staircase. Each step echoed in the silence, the sounds swallowed by the enclosing walls. The air grew colder, damp, and smelled of rust and something sharper, like iron. Somewhere deep below, faint sounds moved in the shadows, almost imperceptible, as though the hidden chamber was breathing. At last, he reached the bottom. His flashlight swept over the room. What he saw made him step back. The chamber was vast, far larger than the cabin above suggested. Crates stacked high filled the space, their surfaces stamped with strange emblems, unmarked seals, chemical symbols, government insignia that were oddly unfamiliar. Maps with grids and coordinates were tacked to the walls. Rolled blueprints lay scattered on tables. Piles of folders sat neatly, almost too neatly, as though someone had been expecting discovery. John's breath caught. His hand moved to one of the folders. He opened it. Inside were documents printed with official letterheads, each page filled with technical diagrams and handwritten notes. One folder in particular made him freeze. Its title read, Project Hemlock, Classified. He began to read. His pulse quickened. The folder contained detailed plans of a covert operation disguised as ecological research in the surrounding forest. But the reality was far more disturbing. The operation involved biological testing under the cover of environmental study. Civilians had been unknowingly exposed to experimental substances. The plans named locations, timelines, and personnel, and one phrase was repeated in bold letters: containment priority, absolute. John's jaw tightened. He flipped through more documents. Photos of people, samples of specimens, coded reports. Each page deepened the weight in his chest. His breath felt colder. This was not an accident. This was a calculated project. Someone in power had been hiding this here, beneath an ordinary cabin in the forest. A slow, creeping realization settled over him. The cabin was not a hideout. It was the nerve center. The dog barked again from above, its tone sharper, almost urgent. John glanced toward the staircase. He felt a surge of betrayal, the same sharp bitterness he had felt years ago in war when orders came without reason and lives were lost without justice. How many lives had been sacrificed for this cover-up? The thought burned in him. His hands trembled slightly, but his mind was clear. This was bigger than curiosity now. It was truth, and uncovering it would change everything. Somewhere above, the forest stood in silence. Somewhere deep below, a conspiracy lay waiting. John Carter knew he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The chill of the underground chamber lingered in John's bones as he clutched the folder to his chest. His heart pounded with a storm of disbelief and fury. Every document, every symbol, every hidden note was a scar carved into the truth, a truth meant to be buried forever. He couldn't leave it there, not after everything he'd seen. With a sharp motion, John gathered the papers, stacking as many as he could carry. The edges scraped his skin, but he hardly noticed. He slipped them into his jacket and began the climb back up the spiral staircase. The dog barked from above, its tone restless, as if it sensed danger approaching. John moved faster, his breath steady but fierce. The sound of the forest greeted him as he pushed open the trapdoor. But it wasn't the quiet calm he had left behind. The air had shifted. A deep rumble echoed from the dirt road. Gravel crunched beneath heavy tires. John stepped outside just as a black SUV emerged from the trees, its tinted windows reflecting the dying light of evening. The vehicle stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then the doors opened. Two men stepped out. Tall, dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. Their movements were precise, practiced, and far too calm. One of them adjusted his jacket, revealing the glint of a weapon at his side. The other scanned the surroundings, eyes sharp as glass. "You shouldn't be here," the first man said, his voice controlled and steady, the kind of tone used by someone who expected obedience. "That dog led you here for a reason. Now you know too much." John's pulse hammered. He looked down at the German shepherd standing beside him, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the strangers. For a brief moment, realization struck him. The dog hadn't been a wanderer. It had been a guide, a guardian drawn to the truth buried in these woods. But why him? Why now? John didn't have the answers, but he remembered the words his late platoon leader had told him years ago in the middle of a desert night. Truth is a burden worth carrying. No matter how heavy, those words had kept him alive once. Now they steadied him again. He turned toward the men, his jaw tightening. "You've been hiding this for years," he said quietly. "Whatever you buried down there, it ends tonight." The first man's expression hardened. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand enough," John replied. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then everything moved at once. One of the men reached for his weapon. John reacted instinctively. He grabbed a length of rusted metal pipe lying by the cabin's wall, something once part of the roof's drainage, and swung it in a sharp arc. The air cracked. The clash that followed was fierce but brief, filled with motion, shouts, and the thud of impact muffled by the whisper of trees. When it was over, the men retreated to their vehicle, one clutching his shoulder, the other shouting orders into a radio. The SUV roared to life, reversing down the narrow path before vanishing into the shadows. John stood still, chest heaving, the pipe still in his grip. The forest was silent again, except for the sound of the wind stirring the leaves. The dog sat beside him, panting quietly, its eyes on the disappearing lights. He knew this wasn't the end. They would come back. Not just for the documents, but for anyone who dared expose what was hidden. He looked down at his jacket, where the stolen files rustled softly against his chest. Inside them lay evidence that could bring an entire network of lies into the light. The stakes were no longer just about curiosity or justice. They were personal now. John Carter stared into the forest's dark horizon, his expression set in quiet defiance. Whatever came next, he was ready. The truth had found him, and he would not let it die in silence. The morning light broke through a curtain of mist as John Carter drove back toward town, the folder of documents resting on the passenger seat beside him. The weight of the papers seemed heavier than it should have been, not because of their contents, but because of what they represented, truth that had slept too long beneath the soil. The dog sat in the back seat, its eyes calm now, head resting against the window. In the stillness between them, there was understanding. The forest had offered its secret, and now it was time to bring that secret into the light. John parked near an old brick building in downtown Portland, a place he hadn't visited in years. Inside, the scent of coffee and newspaper ink filled the air. Behind a cluttered desk stacked with reports sat Claire Donovan, a journalist John had known during his service years. She had earned a reputation for integrity, for never turning away from the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. When she saw him walk in, her brow furrowed. "John Carter," she said softly, setting aside her notes. "You look like you've been carrying a storm." He placed the folder on her desk. "You'll want to see this," he said. They spent hours reading. Each page revealed another layer. Reports stamped with official seals, coded communications, records of experiments disguised as environmental work. By the time they finished, silence filled the room. Claire's expression was pale but steady. "This could change everything," she whispered. John nodded. "That's the point." Over the next few days, Claire worked tirelessly. She verified the evidence, traced the symbols, and followed the chain of command buried in the paperwork. John stayed close, answering what he could, piecing together details from memory and intuition. Each revelation added another spark to the story, one that could no longer be contained. Then, one morning, it happened. The story broke. Headlines appeared across major outlets. Underground operation exposed. Covert testing in Oregon forest linked to federal agency. Images of the documents filled screens. Voices that had once been silent began to speak. The weight of the truth rippled outward like waves across still water. Within days, officials announced a formal investigation. High-ranking figures were questioned, and the hidden operation was dismantled. Arrests followed. The forest, once a place of secrecy, became a symbol of accountability. For the first time in years, John felt something he had long forgotten: relief. Not the fleeting kind, but a deep, quiet sense that the burden he carried had found its purpose. Weeks later, he returned to the outskirts of the forest. The air was crisp again, just like the evening when everything began. The cabin stood unchanged, though now it felt different, not a place of shadows, but of remembrance. The German shepherd waited near the tree line, resting peacefully, eyes following him as he approached. John knelt beside the animal, running a hand over its fur. "You did good," he murmured. The dog gave a faint wag of its tail, a silent acknowledgment. He looked toward the horizon where the forest met the sky. Somewhere out there, justice had taken root. The lies that once grew in silence had been torn out by their roots, and light had returned to the soil. John Carter exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had gripped him for years begin to fade. He knew some truths came with a cost, but this one had given meaning to everything he had endured. As the wind rustled through the trees, he stood once more at the edge of the clearing, watching the dog settle near the cabin door. There was no need for words. The bond between them, forged in mystery, tested by danger, and sealed in truth, spoke louder than anything else could. For the first time since he'd left the battlefield, John Carter felt peace. Not because the world had become perfect, but because he had faced its darkness and chosen light. The truth was out there now, and it would continue to shine, long after he was gone. And as he turned to leave, the forest stood silent behind him, no longer a place of secrets, but of solace.